of the reasons that we are in the financial mess that we are today globally is that people do not understand the difference between currency and money. Currency is a medium of exchange, a unit of account. It is portable, durable, divisible, and something called fungible. Fungible means that each unit is the same as the next unit. A dollar in my pocket buys the same amount as a dollar in your pocket. Money is all of those things plus a store of value over a long period of time. Even financial planners, bankers, your accountant, they don't understand the difference between currency and money. The currency in your pocket is a medium of exchange. It's a unit of account because it's got numbers on it. It's somewhat durable, it's portable, it's divisible in that you can make change, and it's fungible. A dollar in my pocket buys the same amount as a dollar in your pocket. But because governments can print more and more and more of it and dilute the currency supply, it's continually transferring wealth out of your pocket, out of your bank account, to the government and to the banking system.
Guess where we're going? Right up there, guys. No, not Wells Fargo.
Oh, you do it now. 19 yeah. Yeah. That's why I was calling you first. But I called him.
Nice.
You still have that one girl from Boston? He goes, I usually charge spot price for the new brand. Oh, thank you, man.
Now these here, if you want these two, you know, you can look at these because that's what the
Nice. These are all nice.
Yeah. Oh,
Somebody was up there
Civil
with
War.
your card and a few coins.
Yeah, that was TJ that got on.
Okay.
I own the auction at Lost Gap.
Yeah,
Me
yeah.
and him is good friends.
Okay.
He's in and out.
Right,
He
right.
wasn't able to be here today. So,
Okay.
Brian called, needed some coins. I met him up here.
Right.
Certain coins you collect, you just get
I
them.
just every little bit every now and then. If I see something like a little gram bar or something to go, just always see what they're running and go from there.
How much is the bar right here?
Yeah. Just come through every now and then and see. Always think it's better to have it smaller.
That is nice.
That's what we were just talking
Yeah,
about.
you can always kind of move them if you need a little money.
The lady was talking, the lady came here the other day and bought an ounce
Right.
of gold. She
Right.
said, well, I can buy a city block if I got to. You know, how many people can go and sell a
You
city
gonna
block?
sell it. This is exactly right. Like, you know how much you want for that?
I have no idea. I can look it up.
Eastern Bank of Alabama. Okay. I found a new way
When I was
to.
on top of it, you can have it turn on.
Right. Okay. And actually about
If you look at what's really going on, it's a con game. And so there's confidence. Well, the Federal Reserve is very forthright about what they're doing. If you read their websites, they'll tell you it's a confidence game. They tell you that there's no intrinsic value in their money. They'll tell you that they print it backed by absolutely nothing. They actually display all these facts. But if you tell somebody in the public that this stuff is created out of thin air, there's no backing whatsoever, it's absolutely worthless, it's about as valuable as monopoly money, they'll look at you like you're nuts.
Is there an example throughout history of a fiat currency, a piece of paper that's unbacked by anything, surviving?
Short answer, no. Long answer, no. And here's why. When Addison Wiggin took over at the Daily Record, when they got cranked up, Bill Warner asked him to catalog all of the fiat currencies throughout history and what happened to each of them. Addison dutifully went to work. Within a short period of time, he had gone through the alphabet. All the fiat currencies that started with the letter A were done. They all went to zero. He was halfway through the letter B, and all the fiat currencies that started with the letter B, and there were 600 of them in just the first letter and a half of the alphabet, and every single one of them went to zero. every one. 600 fiat currencies that start with the letter A, and half of the ones that start with the letter B are 600 of these things. Not one ever came close. You think this one, the United States dollar, is going to be the first one after all that? I don't think so. No. No currency, fiat currency has ever survived. None.
I pulled all them out of this one. So that's $200.
I'll let you do it.
Hey, what I'm saying is, give me the 200 for that. I just gotta keep up where I got them from, you know what I'm saying? Oh,
What is that? Agriculture.
he may not
$100 billion. Zimbabwe. Now, if y'all have kept up with world currencies, the Zimbabwe dollar is the Zimbabwe currency is not worth anything anymore. I don't know if you've seen videos of the Zimbabwe people actually put their currency in a wheelbarrow and go to the store with a barrel full of their currency. And all it bought was a stick of gum.
In ancient Rome, one of the fastest ways to accumulate personal wealth was to hold office and bestow favors on individuals or businesses in return for gifts. In other words, bribery. In the modern USA, I hate to say it, but not a lot has changed. Cronyism is now the norm in Washington. This is where industries and individuals can basically buy a politician to vote a certain way. In some cases, we've seen their influence extend to the highest levels, where outsiders are writing the legislation and having their cronies introduce it. We've also seen the advent of revolving door politics, where politicians may not take cash directly as bribes, but as soon as they've fulfilled their purpose in politics, they walk out the door of public disservice and into highly paid positions in the private sector. How convenient.
other stuff too. She came in. Oh, she hadn't looked through these now because I just pulled these out. You know what I'm
Show
saying?
nickel
So she don't have
and
all.
cent.
This naked one.
It's nice. Check that out. Check that out.
That's why I pulled it over to the side.
Pretty.
I didn't figure you would want it. You know what I'm saying? But
I didn't agree with that.
so that's
There she be.
That's 3 right here. So it'll be 500.
Right.
The 1916D.
That's what I'm offering.
This is the one. Is this the dime that he put? 1916D.
Yeah. 1916 these.
Oh,
That's
so,
the one.
okay, so I was wrong. I thought he videotaped the one my mom brought me. He's got his own.
And how much is that one? The
Probably
1916.
about $1,900.
$1,900. Ooh. Choked in my own oxygen. $1,900.
The system they have is failing. It's falling apart. Keynesianism won't work. To me, we're in the beginning stages of what happened to the Soviet system. We may be like at 1987 in the Soviet system, where 2 years later, 4 years later, it was gone. And that could happen to us. And as long as people will still use the dollar, it's going to continue. But we're getting dangerously close. And the end stages of a currency system comes rapidly. So even though we've been slipping and sliding for 100 years, our dollar is now worth 2 cents over 100 years. That's pretty much of a crash, but it isn't a crash in the sense of going off a cliff. And I believe that history shows that currencies eventually can go off a cliff when a false confidence is just dissipated. And we have a confidence, but it's based on all false notions and maybe out of desperation, a lot of rigging. But anyway, it's still working. The dollar, although weaker as an international currency, still works. But that is what we, as a people, and not only the United States, around the world, have to fear, because it will affect the whole world when this comes. And this is why this issue, for me, is so important.
Okay. All right. Perfect. So that's 400, and this is
He's
5.
already done paid for every bit of it.
Okay, so 5. So that's 9. How much is this?
That is, right there is $200 in mercury down.
200.
Mhm.
So this is 700
Yeah,
plus
this
the
is
400 there. Okay,
400 right here.
so that's 1100 in coins. No,
Yeah.
1100 in silver. We're not buying
I was
coins.
wondering
We're
what you
buying
were saying.
silver.
I was going to give you a hard time about that. I was going to say, ain't you the one that just got through telling me that we ain't buying coins, we're buying silver?
We are in big trouble, and there's just no way out. And I am sorry to say about that. And I love my country, and I'm sick to death about what's happening to it because of morons in government and a big bunch of morons in academia who let the Federal Reserve do what it did. It's all so simple. It could have all been prevented. But just by following the damn Constitution, money shall only be silver and gold. How simple can it be? It's less than a dozen words. And all you got to do is follow that. Yeah, we have got a prayer. We haven't got, only people who got a prayer are the people who are buying silver and gold today.
That's going to be a more tangible asset than
Oh yes,
quarters and 50 cents.
right.
What, the dime?
Dimes, because, it's just like a lady that was in here the other day bought that gold coin. You know, she paid $2,400 on the coin. I wouldn't have gave you $2,400 for it, but that was what it was graded out for, Brian. And she said, well, if something happens, I can buy me a house or whatever else. And I was like, okay. And the other guy that was in here after she left, I'm like, I wouldn't buy nothing that big because if it does go to hell, ain't nobody else going to have that much, money to swap out to gold.
I believe it's going to be a very short-lived deflation followed by potentially a hyperinflation. And the reason is something we're going to talk about in this episode, and it's velocity of currency. And that is all controlled by psychology. I'm very fond of saying that the economy is both psychological and psychological. It runs in waves and cycles, and those waves and cycles are very logical because of the psychology that's going on behind it, and that psychology controls the velocity of currency. Now, I like to teach through the looking glass of history, so I'm going to read you a little bit of my book because there's a perfect example of this in the Weimar hyperinflation. At the beginning of World War I, Germany went off the gold standard and suspended the right of its citizens to redeem their currency, the mark, for gold and silver. Like all wars, World War I was a war of and by the printing press. The number of marks in circulation in Germany quadrupled during the war. Prices, however, had not kept up with the inflation of the currency supply, so the effects of this inflation were not felt. The reason for this peculiar phenomenon was because in times of uncertainty, people tend to save every penny, and World War I was definitely a time of uncertainty. So even though the German government was pumping tons of currency into the system, no one was spending it, yet. But by war's end, confidence flooded back along with the currency that had been on the sidelines, and the ravaging effects worked their way through the country as prices rose to catch up with the previous monetary inflation. Just before the end of the war, the exchange rate between gold and the mark was about 100 marks per ounce. But by 1920, it was fluctuating between 1,000 and 2,000 marks per ounce. Retail prices shortly followed suit, rising by 10 to 20 times. Anyone who still had the savings they had accumulated during the war was bewildered when they found it could only buy 10% or less of what it could just a year or two earlier. Then, all through the rest of 1920 and the first half of 1921, inflation slowed, and on the surface, the future was beginning to look a little brighter. The economy was recovering. Business and industrial production was up. But now there were war reparations to pay, so the government never stopped printing currency. In the summer of 1921, prices started rising again, and by July of 1922, prices had risen another 700%. This was the breaking point, and what broke was people's confidence in their economy and their currency. Having watched the purchasing power of their savings fall by 90% in 1919, they knew better this time around. They were smarter. They had been here before. All at once, the entire country's attitude toward currency changed. People knew that if they held on to their currency for any period of time, they'd get burned. The rising prices would wipe out their purchasing power. Suddenly, everybody started to spend their currency as soon as they got it. The currency had become a hot potato, and no one wanted to hang on to it for a second. Now, on the next page, I talk about the front page of the New York Times 1923, and I reference some information there. And I just happen to have a reprint of the front page of the New York Times from 1923. And there's an article here about the German hyperinflation. But what I find more interesting than that is the entire paper is this wonderful time capsule. And if you replaced the names and dates and names of countries and so on in most of these articles, it would all be pertinent today. You'd think that you were reading today's newspaper. But when it comes to this article on the German hyperinflation, it talks about these paper mills pumping out 45 billion marks per day. Now, this is the February edition of the New York Times. By November, those paper mills were pumping out 500 quadrillion marks per day. So now we're going to take a look at velocity and how it could affect us in the future. So this is me. Now, I developed this keynote presentation to make understanding velocity easy. Most economists make it sound really complex and people don't think they can understand it. But stick with me, I think you'll enjoy this. When you're measuring velocity, you're measuring the number of times each unit of currency changes hands. I'm going to have lunch, and I'm going to pay the waiter. I'm going to tip him $1. And then he parked in a red zone that morning, so his car got towed. He's going to have to take a cab home, and he's going to pay that cab driver that same dollar when he gets to his destination. Then later on that day, the cab driver is going to have to fill his cab with gas, and he's going to use that same dollar again as part of the payment to pay for his tank of gas. So that dollar was used in 1, 2, 3 transactions. It had a velocity of 3 that day. In other words, $1 bought $3 worth of goods and services. Now we're going to kick this up a notch, and we're going to call this a country of 10 people, this economy of just 10 people, and their currency supply is $1. That's the only dollar that exists. And it circulates once, and so you've got $1 times a velocity of 1 equals a GDP. The health of the size of the economy is $1. If it circulates twice, it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So $1 times a velocity of 10, or 10 transactions, equals a $10 GDP, the health of that economy. Now, if you expand the currency supply, we've given each one of these people $1. If they all make a transaction, there has now been 10 transactions, but each dollar was only involved in one of them. So it's a currency supply of $10 times 1 transaction each equals a $10 GDP. So even though you've got 10 times the currency supply, the economy has the same vibrance. There was 10 transactions, it equals $10. Then we have a second transaction, a third, a fourth. This could be a healthy economy. It could also be an economy running into hyperinflation. Keynesians, that's the type of economists that are running the modern day economy, believe that you can create a healthy economy by changing this figure here, the size of the currency supply. So the Federal Reserve thinks that by adding currency to the economy, that they're going to be able to stimulate it and make the economy grow. And the thing is, it isn't the quantity of currency, it's the amount of goods and services that are created in that country that determines the country's level of prosperity. So if you just add a bunch of currency, all it's going to do eventually is drive up prices. Velocity will slow at first, and that's what we're seeing now. Well, the same thing happened in Weimar Germany. This is the entire hyperinflation from the beginning of World War I in 1914 until the end of 1923. And most economists are attracted to this big hyperinflation on the end. But one thing I discovered when I was writing my book is that there's almost always a pre-hyperinflation hyperinflation. And we see one here, where there's this rise of prices and quantity of currency, and then it levels off for a little while, and then rises again. And this has to do with the psychology. This is the time where I said those people had been there before and experienced that. I'm going to zoom up on it. And so here you see the currency supply increasing. So they're doing monetary inflation, but prices stay level, and the price of gold actually dropped toward the end of the war. But as soon as the anxiety is lifted from the population, and they start feeling better, all of that currency comes out of hiding and people start making transactions, and velocity picks up, and prices, and the price of gold especially, just rose dramatically and then leveled off some 16 times higher than they were originally. Notice that the currency supply is growing at a certain rate. The prices are delayed, and then bam, they rise to meet it and exceed it, and then stabilize to account for that quantity of currency. Now, back to this original chart here, what I find interesting is that during the war, it lagged, and then it caught up and matched the currency supply. But then, as they kept on printing, velocity started to exceed the currency supply. So prices started to rise faster than they were printing currency, and that's the end game for hyperinflation. The big lesson here is that the people who owned gold and silver instead of the national currency came out relatively unscathed, or even made huge gains in their purchasing power. Now, this is the U.S. currency supply from 1918 until today. And we've created all of this currency, but we haven't seen any ravaging inflation yet. And that is because velocity has fallen to compensate for the creation of currency. But there will come a time when the psychology of the country changes, and you will see, after this short-term deflation, where velocity falls even further, you will then see the velocity pick up and prices will rise. And I believe that we will go into a hyperinflation because they're going to create more currency than this. And that currency is going to be sitting there, and velocity will have slowed and slowed and slowed to compensate it until something changes psychologically. The beginning of every hyperinflation looks like everything is okay again. The economy gets better, velocity picks up, and that's the really danger point, and nobody can see it as velocity starts picking up.
Right. Well, of course, there's a name for that. It's called money illusion, which is before the inflation really kicks in and either gets extreme or turns into hyperinflation. There is this feel-good period where, there's more money around and, unemployment's dropping and people feel more prosperous. The prices haven't quite skyrocketed yet. It's all illusory because it'll go away once the price level adjusts. But there is that kind of, period in between, and it is a feel-good period, but it doesn't last very long. But you're making a very good point, which is a lot of people assume that inflation is a function of money supply or money printing, and that's not right. It's a partial function of money supply, but the other part of the function is behavioral. It has to do with velocity, which is just a psychological phenomenon. Do you feel good? Do you want to go out for dinner? Do you want to take your friends? Do you want to take a vacation, or do you want to stay home, leave your money in the bank, and watch TV? Those are two different states of the world, based a lot on your confidence and how you feel. Both things have to come together to get the kind of inflation the Fed wants. Now, here's the problem. They can make the money supply whatever they want. And they're certainly printing trillions of dollars. We understand that. So far, They have not been able to bend the velocity curve. They have not been able to get you and me and everyone else in America and around the world to spend more money. But let's say they do. They change the psychology. They change the behavior. Once you change it, it's very hard to change it back. It's not like throwing an on-off switch. I mean, it's taken years for the Fed to, kind of try to inject an inflation scare, try to get some inflation. But what if it actually comes? What if inflation goes from 1% to 3% in a matter of 6 months and stays there and looks like it's going to 3.5%? Well, the next stop is 10%. It's not, the Fed thinks they can dial it back down to 2.5%, which is what they say they want. But what they'll find is once that velocity, once that behavioral genie is out of the bottle, they won't be able to get it back in. It'll take off. It'll take on a life of its own. What's the Fed going to do? Raise interest rates to 10% with unemployment at 7%? I mean, people go down and burn down the Fed. I mean, there are limits on what they can do. But the point is, once it starts, and you're exactly right, it's a feedback loop. It feeds on itself. The Fed thinks they can control it. They're wrong. The behavioral aspect of it will be out of control, and like I say, we'll be on our way to 10%, if not worse.
It seems like all of these bright minds that want to run things, none of them trust the free market mechanism.
Well, I think that's right. They will talk to you ad nauseum about the failures of the free markets without realizing that most of the so-called failures are actually the result of misguided government policies from prior times. I'll give you a classic example. 1998 was a warning. That's, started in 1997, capital outflows from emerging markets, started in Thailand. There was blood in the streets in Jakarta and Seoul, made its way to Russia. Russia imploded, took down the hedge fund long-term capital management. I was associated with that, so I had a front row seat on that disaster. And finally, the world built a firewall around Brazil, and Brazil did not collapse, although it would have been the next domino to fall. Now, there was a clear-cut lesson. Capital markets came within hours of complete closure. And I was there. I sat with Peter Fisher, who was head of open market operations at the Fed, his associate Dino Cost. We were on the phone with Bill McDonough, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Gary Gensler was there from the Treasury, all the lawyers, all the bankers on Wall Street. We were trying to hold this together. Now, we did bring it in for a soft landing, so the world has kind of forgotten about that episode. But it was extremely close and extremely delicate. We were literally hours away from shutting down global bond markets and stock markets. Now, what lessons were learned? Well, the lessons...
Well, that cascades into the credit card not working and the gas coming out, not coming out
Correct.
of the pump.
That's right. There would have been a global bank holiday, we were hours away from that. Now, it didn't happen, so everyone's like, oh, no big deal, it's fine, But there were some lessons that should have been learned. Banks should have been broken into smaller units. Derivatives should have been banned, et cetera. There were things that should have been learned from that. Instead, what did? We did the opposite. We repealed Glass-Steagall, which allowed banks to be hedge funds. We repealed swaps regulation, which allowed them to create swaps and derivatives on all kinds of other things that had never been done before. We repealed the net capital rule for broker-dealers, so instead of 15-to-1 leverage, you were allowed to have 30-to-1 leverage, which Lehman had on the day it went down. We implemented Basel II, which allowed banks to use more leverage. We did the exact opposite of what we should have learned in 1998. Is it any surprise that 10 years later, we had a bigger catastrophe, almost destroyed capital markets again, and now here we are not learning the lessons again. We haven't done anything we need to do, so therefore, we're going to have another catastrophe sooner than later. It'll be bigger than 2008, but the next one's going to be strike three. We've had 2 warnings. They've been ignored. The third time, it's game over.
All right, so
Oh, I love the science.
Bobby,
I can play with it all day.
thank you so much for letting us rip you off.
You ain't doing nothing to me. I just got a key to the store.
Okay, TJ, if you're listening, thank you for letting us rip you off by giving you fiat dollars so we can get some real money.
I don't see any particular difference between my outlook and yours. Certainly a situation where society owes more than it can pay and where it has to default, either honestly or dishonestly, is deflationary. Debt liquidation.
Honestly being just a default. We are bankrupt, we can't pay you.
Yeah.
Dishonestly inflating the debt away.
Exactly. Honestly would be to say to the bondholders, yeah, that's right, we say we're going to pay you back, and we say we're going to pay you back with interest. Well, too bad, so sad. Times are tough, we lied. Strong letter to follow, right? Say to guys like me, you're 60? Yep, I know, you're supposed to get Social Security when you're 62 or 65. The truth is, we don't have the money, so you're not going to get it. Right? That's the honest way. I think the yield to politician is very low. with regards to the honest way. So I think that we're going to have deflationary scares, and I think we're going to have deflationary events. I think we're going to have asynchronous events like long-term capital management and things like that, that will initially have deflationary outcomes. But I suspect, like you, that the demand for the public will be for the big thinkers to solve that problem and solve it in the only way they know how, which is to fill every crack, even the Grand Canyon, with currency.
So how is this all going to play out? You know, I don't know exactly, but what I do know is that the longer this goes on, the bigger it's going to be. And I wrote about some of the possibilities in my book. And this was written before the crisis of 2008. And so in here, I refer to Ben Bernanke, but I'm going to change that to just the Federal Reserve or central banks for you right now. So, the day of reckoning will come when millions of baby boomers reach the age where they have to take mandatory distributions from their IRAs. As they find that the investments they were counting on for their retirement, their homes and their IRAs full of mutual funds, have actually lost value, that the amount of stuff that they can buy from the proceeds if they sell their home is actually less than when they bought their home. And as they realize that their dream of a comfortable retirement was just that, a dream, all those boomers will get scared and pull in their horns. They will stop spending. They will start selling off their assets. And the greatest stock market crash in history will unfold as more and more boomers panic and sell. I believe this will also be accompanied by the greatest real estate crash the world has ever known. This perfect storm of bankruptcies and foreclosures will cause the currency supply to contract as the giant credit bubble pops, and all those big spenders become big savers. When people save their currency, it stops circulating. The economic engine runs out of oil, and the whole thing locks up. This is every central banker's worst nightmare. This is real deflation. And the world's central bankers are about to discover the true scale of the horrors of a credit bubble implosion. When this happens, the Federal Reserve will once again send out its armada of money bomb-dropping helicopters, but this time, something will be different. Something will have gone horribly wrong. The bombs will have been defused. The Fed will try pumping the banking sector by buying up every kind of debt they can get their hands on, but to no avail. They will go to the extraordinary measures that they had said they were prepared to go to. They will buy every mortgage, mortgage-backed security, and any other type of debt that panicky investors and banks are trying to sell, but nothing good will come of it. They will start buying stocks to buoy the stock market, but retail sales will continue to plunge. They will try broad-based tax cuts, but it won't jumpstart the economy. They will work with foreign central banks to buy each other's debt, but the global economy will continue to plummet. People will finally see through the veil. They will see what Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Lion, and the Tin Man saw, that the Wizard of Oz is really just some dopey old guy frantically pulling levers. Remember when we talked about how during World War I, the Germans increased their currency supply by 400%, yet there was no price inflation because of the public's anxiety over the war and the uncertainty of their future? Imagine the anxiety 75 million baby boomers will feel as they approach retirement, only to find their homes and their mutual funds are now worth next to nothing. The nest egg, ladies and gentlemen, has just cracked. When they get their tax rebates, are they going to buy that new big screen TV and the latest cell phone? I think not. I think they're going to save every dime they can get their hands on, just like in Germany during the war. But there will be a point at which a threshold is reached. For each income class, it will be different. It will be the point where they feel that they've finally got enough saved for retirement. For some, it will be $100,000. For others, it will be $1 million. and for others still, it will be $10 million. The Fed knows there is a point where they'll finally feel safe enough to replace that aging computer and maybe get that new TV. At this point, the boys at the Fed will buy enough government debt to fund tax rebates for all the taxes in the previous year, but still, nobody will buy that new car. The threshold the Fed is looking for will not be reached. Then, in not-so-quiet desperation, the Fed will say, "Screw the helicopters, send in the bombers." And as the shadow of millions of stealth currency bombers darken the skies, currency will begin to fall like rain in the desert. As Joe Sixpack and John Q get tax rebate checks in the mail for all the taxes they paid during their entire lifetimes, fear will be temporarily alleviated and some of that currency will come out of hiding, just as in Weimar Germany. Prices will rise quickly and dramatically as all that stored-up currency energy is released. In a panic, the Fed will call back the bombers, but it will be too late. There's nothing they will be able to do to stop it now because the hyperinflation will have already begun. The Dow will begin an invisible crash of epic proportions and gold prices will shoot to the moon. If you are wise enough to moor your boat in the safe harbors of gold and silver and other commodities, you will weather the storm. It won't be pretty, but at least you'll be safe. At this point, confidence in the currency will fall faster than it can be created. Cost of living increases for government employees, and the costs of all government projects, the subcontractors, the labor, the materials, will all skyrocket. And each time more currency is created to pay for the increases, the value of the currency will fall even faster. In times like that, governments have only two choices: shut down the government and all of its projects and services, send everybody home without pay, turn off the printing presses, and wait for the free market system to discover price levels that account for the quantity of the currency in the supply, or print the currency into oblivion. Governments have always chosen the latter. But the stored-up energy of excess currency creation doesn't have to take place within the United States, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the future. In fact, there is an abundance of stored-up currency just waiting to be released right now. As I mentioned earlier, all the dollars we sent overseas to other countries to buy their goods and services are now sitting in their bank accounts, just waiting to be spent. Eventually, the world economy will lose faith in the U.S. dollar and will want to dump it by buying up goods. And as all those dollars come flooding back into the U.S., it will, of course, cause the prices of those goods and services to rise and could, and probably will, trigger a scenario much like the one I have just finished describing. Throughout history, economists have suffered from what I like to call this time syndrome. This time, they've become masters of the economic universe. This time, they've figured it out. This time, they've tamed the economy. This time, they've mastered the art of infinite currency amplification. This time, a fiat currency will work. History gives this a probability of 0. Each time we sailed toward economic doom, the greatest financial minds in the world were at the helm. Do you really think we should continue letting them steer the ship?
You want that rough one?
Yes.
We're not buying coins, Bobby. We're buying silver.
6, 8.
Well, he told me to put a Walker back that you couldn't read the date on. That's the reason why I asked you. I have.
All right, thank you.
And so that would be 400, 200 more down.